Would you believe that for decades, Chicago had a major commercial airport right on its lakefront, until seemingly out of nowhere, it disappeared overnight? That's right, even though this city utility was integral to the local livelihood, it was bulldozed on one fateful night in 2003, and when Chicagoans rose from their beds, they were shocked to see massive X's carved into the runway. But how could something like this even happen? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the unbelievable story of Meigs Field Airport. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. These days, most big cities have their airports located on the outskirts or even further away. Think London, New York, Paris, just to name a few. That actually makes a lot of sense. Airports tend to be noisy, create a lot of traffic, and a significant level of noise pollution. But the city of Chicago offers something of a different story. Although not as big as the O'Hare International Airport, Meigs Field was relatively busy, despite being located less than just 2 miles away from Chicago's Union Station. You're probably thinking it was totally insane to build an airport right in the middle of downtown Chicago, among those tall skyscrapers, and you would be right. The airfield was actually located on Northerly Island, a small piece of land artificially erected on the lakefront. This allowed for a safe and relatively easy approach without planes having to weave their way through the densely inhabited city. This artificial island was first proposed in 1909 by Daniel Hudson Burnham, a famous American architect and urban designer. His seminal plan for Chicago featured ideas for wider streets, railroads, harbors, and, most importantly, municipal parks. With that in mind, Burnham's original plan for the island was to host a beautiful park, but after his death in 1912, the co-author of the plan, Edward H. Bennett, suggested that the island could also be a convenient site for an airport. And so it was. In 1920, Chicago voters approved a $20 million budget to finance the construction of the island, and the work began. Around the same time, more and more planes were finding their way into the city of Chicago. The first one landed in 1910 in Grant Park, a large green area in the vicinity of Northerly Island. The park then started serving as a makeshift landing strip for regular airmail service that started operating in the city as early as 1918. It was clear to everyone, however, that Chicago needed a proper airport. After 1922, thanks to a suggestion from Mayor William Hale Thompson and the Chicago Association of Commerce, the idea of converting the island into an airfield was seriously considered. Heck, even the body representing the Chicago Park District, which still owned the land, liked this proposal. This meant that throughout the better part of the 20th century, when the airport was active and even at its peak in the 1980s, the land below the runway still belonged to the local park authority. At that time, no one suspected that it would be this seemingly small fact that would seal the airport's future over 80 years later. Meigs Field opened on December the 10th, 1948. The property had to be expanded by 24 acres through a big landfill to accommodate the runway, of course. Now, you might wonder why it took almost 30 years from the initial idea to opening the actual airfield. The answer is simple: the Great Depression and then World War II. Originally known simply as Lakefront Airport, it was renamed in 1950 to Merle C. Meigs Field, after a local publishing mogul who was especially fond of aviation. The airfield quickly started receiving significant air traffic, becoming the busiest single-runway airport in the entire United States. It was, in fact, so busy that in 1955 it had to be expanded to 3,900 feet to improve its landing capacity. Meigs Field became a vital hub for various operations, accommodating a wide range of connections managed by Illinois Airlines, connecting Chicago to cities such as Freeport, Madison, Rockford, or Sterling. At that time, the primary aircraft seen at Meigs were the de Havilland Dove and Piper Navajo twin-engined aircraft. By the late 1950s, Chicago Helicopter Airways started providing scheduled passenger helicopter service between Meigs Field, O'Hare, and Midway, using Sikorsky S-58C helicopters. Between the 1960s and the late 1970s, passenger service expanded, and the airport also served a critical aerial medical transport role, including the transportation of patients and transplant organs, further underscoring its importance to the entire region. But that's not all. the airport was also a favorite for VIP travelers. Even JFK, during his tenure as president, was known to regularly use Meigs Field. It allowed for a quick and secure helicopter transit from O'Hare to downtown, eliminating the complications brought by a Secret Service escort traveling on Chicago's congested expressways. So, in other words, the airport was a major success. It had connections to cities like Springfield and Carbondale. Then, in the 1980s, the airport started hosting a significant fleet of corporate and private aircraft, and the traffic continued to grow. At its peak in 1980, the Lakefront Airfield handled as many as 80,000 landings and takeoffs per year. That number started dropping significantly in the 1990s, however, due to the growing landing fees. Around that time, the airport started serving several educational functions, providing aviation education and free airplane rides to Chicago youth. Even so, all along, this airport had a side effect that only got worse with the increased traffic of the 1980s. You see, many people were annoyed at the noise and commotion associated with having a busy airport in the very heart of their city. One resident of Bridgeport, a primarily Irish, blue-collar neighborhood of Chicago, took a special dislike to Meigs Field. You guys know who I'm talking about. His name was Richard M. Daley. He was elected mayor in 1989 and ended up serving 7 consecutive terms, becoming the longest tenured mayor of the Windy City. Towards the end of his second term, in 1994, Mayor Daley first announced his plans to close Meigs Field. He almost succeeded. The Chicago Park District refused to renew the airport's lease. The runway indeed closed for a few months, only to reopen the following year due to pressure from the city council. Through a bargain reached between Mayor Daley and Governor Jim Edgar, the airport was allowed to operate for 5 more years, with the city retaining full control over it. But in this time, the pressure to get rid of the airport and go back to Burnham's original plan for Northerly Island just kept increasing. A savage tug of war ensued, with aviation enthusiasts, local businesses, and city council politicians on one side, and the mayor on the other side. Further complicating things was the fact that in 1989, the city accepted a grant from the FAA, which implied that the airport lease had to be extended all the way to 2009. So in a sense, any effort to close the field would breach a federal agreement. Despite all its detractors, it was also clear that the airfield contributed significantly to the local economy, providing jobs and supporting businesses that relied on it for transportation and logistics. So over the next 10 years, the two warring factions appeared to have reached something of a stalemate, but then 9/11 happened. This was indeed a strange time in American politics. Patriotism paired with paralyzing fear of terroristic attacks made many things previously considered unthinkable quite likely to happen. One such event was, in fact, the shutting down of Meigs Field. In a twist that felt like it was taken from a TV sitcom, Mayor Daley decided he'd rather ask for forgiveness than permission. Riding on the growing fears of another attack and quoting safety concerns, Mayor Daley decided to take action under the cover of darkness. On the night of March 30th, 2003, a fleet of bulldozers, accompanied by a heavy police escort, entered the runway and gouged multiple X-shaped holes in the surface. The runway was therefore rendered useless, and a few airplanes were actually left stranded there. However, they were later allowed to leave using the taxi runway. The following day, during a press conference, Daley said, quote, "To do this any other way would have been needlessly contentious." Some sources quote that a few years later he actually recanted that statement, heavily implying that he destroyed the airport because he simply wanted to, and because it was arguably legal to do so. While the critics called the overnight destruction of the runway unnecessary and heavy-handed, the supporters of the park applauded. The FAA, however, was not happy at all. They ordered the city to pay a $33,000 fine for closing an airport that had instrument approach infrastructure, without giving the required 30-day notice. They also later requested the repayment of the $1 million, which was granted to the city as a part of the airport improvement program. It's also said that this money was in fact used to demolish the airport. A legal battle ensued, with the supporters of the airfield hoping to reopen it, a wish that was never destined to come true. Eventually, in 2006, the city of Chicago agreed to pay all of its fines, with the court declaring that since the city owned the airport, it was also in its power to close it. Today, over 20 years later, the island nature reserve that had replaced the airport remains largely underdeveloped. There's a concert venue, a concrete trail for walking and riding bikes, a lagoon, and a few wildlife habitats. The park itself opened only in 2015, and despite plans to continue developing it over the next 20 to 30 years, the island remains mostly covered by wilderness. Some view it as a good thing, and in a way, a true realization of Burnham's vision, a tiny piece of curated wilderness in the vast heart of a major American city. According to the locals, the park remains largely empty, making it an appealing proposition for those tired of the unrelenting crowds in downtown. The concert venue remains quite popular, with artists such as Kelly Clarkson, Kings of Leon, and Billy Strings performing there regularly. And I suspect that against the skyline of Chicago, that must be an amazing place to see a concert. It's quite difficult to take sides in this dispute, so I'm going to put the question in your hands. Was the mayor right to take such drastic action? Would Chicago be better off with it, or do you prefer the presence of a park? Make sure to leave your answer in the comment section below. One thing's for sure, Northerly Island is an integral piece of the town's history, and the 20-year-long battle to close the airport, not to mention the way it was done, might be one of the most entertaining pieces of real-life political drama we've seen in a while. And with that, I thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.